I'm joined this evening with Jonathan Lewis, who is the Assistant Secretary for Pastoral Ministry and Social Concerns for the Archdiocese of Washington, and he was also an auditor and participated for the entire synod on young people, the faith, and vocational discernment that was held in Vatican City in October of this past year. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks, Father Frank. Happy to be with you.
So you were an auditor at the synod, and now the synod didn't just happen. We have this post-synodal apostolic exhortation that came out at the end of, really in April, but it was signed on the solemnity of the Annunciation on March 25th by Pope Francis at the Holy House of Loreto at the shrine there. And he left it there, and as a way of representing that was the place of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph in custom and tradition. And now this has been received by us as the faithful, but who is this written for? Given the way that this was put together?
Right, yeah. Post-synodal exhortations don't just fall out of thin air. It was the process of a multi-year planning and listening of the Vatican and really of faith communities across the world. So the word synod means to walk together, to be synodal. And Pope Paul VI, St. Paul VI, established this process where bishops across the world would come together after Vatican II to continue that spirit of collegiality and dialogue, really representing the people of God worldwide. And so every couple of years they pick a different theme and have a discussion, and they invite bishops, of course, together. This was a bit unique as a synod because for the first time they invited about 30 young adults, young people. So not just talking about young people, but really talking with young people. And so it was a real privilege to be counted among those members in the Synod Hall with Pope Francis and bishops throughout the month. But it wasn't the only time that young people were included. And so the Vatican had an online survey as well as a pre-synod meeting just 6 months or so prior to the synod, of which there were a few Americans as well that participated there. And so you have, thousands and tens of thousands of people online who submitted feedback, asking local dioceses like our own here in the Archdiocese of Washington to host listening sessions and to do our own surveying. And all that got reported up through local bishops' conferences to the Vatican. Then they had this meeting of a few hundred young people in Rome, and then you have the actual synod meeting in person for 30 days or so.
And we were asked as Catholic Apostolate Center to also provide a report from, and we also did a survey, right, which was also sent to the Bishops' Conference as part of that whole process also. And that was quite a unique thing, this pre-synod.
Yeah.
That was something that was a unique aspect of it. There's usually, for every synod, a lineamenta or a preparatory document.
Right.
There's consultation that goes on, similar to this one. Although the surveying was a bit of an interesting new development that sometimes has showed up a bit in the Synod on the Family, the two synods that were held for the Synod in the Family, but not this kind of online, here, give your thoughts. And they wanted a really broad audience I recall that the Archdiocese tried to reach out as far as it could to people, whether they were a part of our faith community or not.
Yeah, I think it's a real innovation in a positive way that the Vatican said we need to listen to the experience of people, the people of God and people of goodwill. And so they specifically said, engage people who go to church, but also talk to those who left and don't practice their faith anymore, or listen to folks who never have had a practice of faith. Recognizing that in that dialogue and conversation, we all learn and grow from one another, that we have to first start by listening and having an encounter with people. And so I think in that sense, when we look at Christ is Alive, the document, or any of the documents that have come as a part of the process, it's not just the content, but the process itself is content. It's a part of that pedagogy, or way we teach or learn. It was very obvious that Pope Francis is a teacher, right? Like, back in his Jesuit days in Argentina, right? He likes to teach, and he models that. Sometimes it takes a while for pupils like bishops and us to pick up on it, but the pedagogy, the method really matters, I think.
And there were documents that came out. So you had the preparatory document. There was a pre-synod document that came out that the synod, pre-synod participants wrote and put forward, and then it was released by the Vatican. And then there was what was called an instrumentum laboris, or a working document, that all of this consultation, all of these different things were all put together in that to prepare you. Now, that was a document that you received prior to your going to Rome to prepare you for your effort and time there as an auditor. So what was an auditor? What does that mean?
Yeah, so the Instrumentum Laboris guides and begins the conversation, and then the Synod is really breaking that open, making edits, throwing pieces out, adding pieces in. So as an auditor, the word means to listen, right? But really, we're participants in the same way, besides voting, as the bishops. Because technically, the Synod is a synod of bishops who represent the local churches and bishops' conferences they come from. But my role as an auditor was to do the same things that all the U.S. bishops and bishops across the world did. So there's two main types of gatherings in these synods. The first is the synod hall meetings. It's called the aula. And so you're sitting kind of in a big movie theater with about 300 seats, so they can only invite that many people or so, with the Pope in the front, and then sort of a stadium seating. Of course, the young people got put in like the cheap seats in the back, which was kind of funny, as we made a little bit of extra noise at time. People would have to kind of turn and look back at us. But in those meetings that lasted, around 9 a.m. with a long lunch break until sometimes 7 p.m. So there were long days in the Vatican. And for those days when we were in the Synod Hall, the responsibility of each participant, bishop and layperson, was to give one talk called an intervention. And they could only be 4 minutes because, like the Grammy Awards, they cut your mic after a certain period of time, which is kind of amusing when like cardinals get their mic cut, or people just clap them off the stage. And so you listen to talk after talk after talk after talk. And they're, of course, in languages across the world, 6 major language groups, of which are translated live. So it's kind of like the United Nations from people who've had that experience before. We've got your earpiece in and you're listening. What was neat is you're sitting in that room listening to a bishop from Canada, and then the next one from Sri Lanka, and the next one is from Indonesia, and the next one's from South Africa. And so you're really getting a sense of what it means to be a part of a global or universal church, which is, of course, what the word Catholic means. In a pretty unique way. I think that was one of my key takeaways, is it's a really big church, and sometimes we don't get the benefit of seeing the different needs and hopes of people worldwide. So we had those big gatherings, and then more practically, because you can't really have conversations in a 300-person room, they break people off into small groups, language-based working groups. And that's where a lot of the real work got done, where you sort of share things that struck you in the Synod Hall. But that's where we would go paragraph by paragraph of that Instrumentum Laboris, the working document, and say, I have a problem with this, or we should add this here. And we had a room of about almost 30 people, so it wasn't a small group, but there were people from 20 countries just in my group, which is, again, really interesting, because there were some disagreements, different cultural experiences. That was real eye-opening. And
that was a mixed group. That wasn't just simply people who were English-speaking auditors, or people who were. This included the bishop participants in the group as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah, there were, I think, of the 35 of us were auditors, and the rest were bishops. There were also some experts, priests, religious laity, a couple of those folks as well. So it was a real mix. Again, we did everything the bishops did, from coffee espresso breaks to the small groups.
And how was that conversation? Was there an open conversation in terms of those? Was it just people mostly deferring to bishops, or was there more of an equality of dialogue that was going on? Would you say?
I think there was a real equality of dialogue, which I would say is surprising in one sense and really encouraging. And we had Cardinal DiNardo from Houston here in the United States as our kind of moderator for the group, and they kind of picked the American to be the moderator. And he did a great job sort of facilitating the conversation, and at times stopping the group and saying, hey, there's a couple of the auditors in the back we haven't heard from in a while. Do you have any any insight into that? So that was a real, I think, mark of what it means to sort of be collaborative in that discussion, and to respect and lift up the experience of different people, especially when we're talking about people who themselves are the subjects of the conversation. And so it was a really rich conversation that was really enjoyable.
And Pope Francis was immersed in every session.
Yeah, he was in all the large group sessions. I think there was only 1 or 2 periods of time where he slipped away because he had to do the big Wednesday audience or different blessings and meetings and things.
So after this, at the end, there was a final document that was developed, and that came out in Italian at first, and then into January, February time. If I remember correctly, it was around somewhere in late January that it finally came out in English. But what was that process like?
Yeah, so that was sort of the final fruit of all of this synod work. So we take this Instrumentum Laboris, the working document, and sort of mix it up, and then the drafters that are elected from the bishops sort of take different interventions and ideas that have been shared throughout the month and sort of weave those together. And they really, the common response was they did a really masterful job of including a lot of different perspectives and themes that different people raised, which of course was quite diverse given the breadth of experience in the room. And so that was voted on, again, at the very last day of the synod. It was read paragraph by paragraph, and all the bishops voted to approve it or not. Of course, every paragraph was approved. They did a nice job. And that became the synod final document. So that's really the best place to learn what the synod was doing and saying. It had the pulse on those conversations.
And Pope Francis said that he's not just rehashing the final document in Christus Vivit, in Christ is alive, his post-synodal apostolic exhortation. He says that within there that he's going to take some points from it, emphasize a few elements, but then points people back to that final document as well. Because at first there was a question as to whether or not he would write an exhortation, but in the end did. And so what's been your reaction to the exhortation, given that you had all this experience of preparing, being in the synod, and so forth?
It's a very different document. In one sense, because it's a letter written to young people. And so I think that's an important context for people to know.
Yes.
It's not similar in style to the beautiful theology of Pope Benedict. It's meant to be a pastoral letter to young people, which of course, with serious pastoral and theological implications. But it really complements, I would say, the various documents before. And in fact, Pope Francis implies, I think, that complementarity by quoting back, as you said, the final document of the synod, by going back and referencing that pre-synodal gathering of young people in a whole paragraph in this magisterial text. And so I think it meant to be read alongside this process of engagement and listening to young people. But I found it really beautiful.
He also quoted from a number of bishops' conferences as well, different documents that were associated with young people and trying to make reference to those, which he's done in other exhortations, also tried to lift up the different wisdom that's come up from bishops' conferences and different documents of bishops of different countries. When you go through the document, and so it really starts very, very clearly with Christ is alive. I mean, here we are in the Easter season and during the octave of Easter, and he goes right for that point, which there were some critics that talked about the bit of the sociological aspect was maybe getting a little too much play, if you will, but really the Holy Father ends up right at the beginning making it clear what is central and that Christ is the center of it all, and then enters into the life reality of people. As you move through it, how do you see the progression of the document and how it flows and the way in which the different topics that it picks up on?
Yeah, I think you're right that the key, the lead starts at the very beginning, that Christ is alive, and it very clearly complements, I think, what some of the more sociological process was, because again, this whole synod process is built on these 3 steps that come from the South American experience and Central American experience of seeing, making an assessment or judging, and acting. Another articulation of that same 3 steps I heard was to listen, to look at the face of Christ, and then to respond. And I think that kind of mirrors what this whole process was, right? This see, judge, act methodology. So we had all this seeing, and now Francis says, let's look together at the face of Christ. And so he starts with that image of Jesus, breaking open the reality that Jesus was a young person. The guy died at 33, what we call a young adult. And so we don't have an incarnate God who is elderly or an elder. We only have a God who was an infant, who was a teenager, and who was a young adult. And so how does that inform our experience? And so Pope Francis says very clearly that Jesus Christ sanctified this period of life by living through it. And then from there breaks open all the stories of Scripture, of the relationships between the young and elders, stories of the saints who themselves were mentored by other people in their youth. And we forget so often how many young people did key things in the life of the church in their 20s and 30s. Sometimes we treat young people today more like kids, or that they haven't quite grown up as young adults, not real adults. But look at the life of Francis. When did he make those key decisions about starting a religious community and leaving his father's fortune? Same with Dominic and many others. I mean, so many of those saints that the document refers to were very young. And then from there, it talks about what the hopes and challenges and aspirations of young people today are in a different context than the life of Christ. And then breaks open sort of one of those key needs, that of our vocation, our calling to service, and then how you discern that call.
And he gets into there are some very significant themes that are present in the document. And one of them is about this proclamation of the kerygma. And for maybe those who are not aware of what that means, he really does a masterful job in laying out what the kerygma is, the initial proclamation of Christ who has lived, died for us, and has risen and is glorified. And being able to say that in language that's really compelling. And so what about this proclamation of the kerygma? How does that figure into this document?
It came up a number of times in the Synod, people's experience that while young people maybe, especially in the West, are drifting away from the church or find institutional church a little less compelling, people are still really interested in Jesus. He remains a fascinating, at worst, character, really inspiring and life-changing character in history at best. And so I think Pope Francis is calling us to look at Jesus in himself. And the kerygma, that basic proclamation, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again, as we used to say in the translation of the Mass. However you articulate that, it really asks for a response. And so I think that's the compelling thing that Francis shines the light on the person of Jesus, which reminds me so much of what Pope Benedict said, that at the heart of Christianity we find an encounter with a person, right? For as much theology or programs that we could dream up or think of in our institutional church, layers of authority or bureaucracy, at the heart, Pope Benedict says, is not structure or canon law, it's a person. And as Pope Francis reminds us, that person, Jesus, is alive. And so it requires a response from us. And I think that's the brilliant part about this. It's one thing to sort of treat faith or Jesus as an idea that's theoretical over there, and then you can ignore it, right? You can sort of set that idea aside in your teenage years or in your 20s and 30s, and then maybe revisit it later when a serious life event happens, someone gets diagnosed with cancer. But Francis is saying, no, Jesus is alive now, and puts the present moment sort of in center stage.
And calls people to life in Christ, and how we can witness that, and that all of us, and including young people, are called to be witnesses in this way, to witness that reality. And it may not be that we have perfect lives, and none of us do. We're all sinners, but we all have the hope that's in Christ, who is alive. He's not just this historic figure, which I think is one of the beautiful pieces that he has. This makes no sense if he's just simply a historic figure who we honor and reverence, but is not present and alive right now within the community of faith and within our world.
Right. Julius Caesar doesn't ask anything of me because he's dead.
Right.
Right. But Jesus, who's alive, does. And I think he points to, and he says very clearly in the document, some people say, oh, the kerygma, that's all kind of loosey-goosey, that's not real substantive theology. And in fact, we gave a presentation together, and someone kind of raised a similar concern, if you recall. But Francis says very clearly, there's nothing more solid than that basic proclamation of faith. And I think often it's about how we communicate faith. We're so used to doing so in classrooms with textbooks, early in the morning, especially with young people, that Francis is saying, no, it has to be experienced. You have to come to an encounter with Jesus Christ, who's alive.
So he also gets into youth protagonism. What does that term mean about youth protagonism?
Yeah, it doesn't work so much in English as it does in the Italian, I think. We only use the word protagonist when we talk about literature or something. But it's the same key theme that young people today are the main actors or the main drivers of this movement.
The future of the church, but the now.
Right, and that's exactly the line Francis used. That was, again, one of my sort of top 10 quotes or so from the document, that young people are the now of God. And that's really striking, I think, to shine the light on young people, not tomorrow, the future of the church, again, but being called to something today. And so I think it's asking the church to assess, does that theoretical reality live up to our practical experience? When you look at our churches and our schools, are young people treated as the now of God? Are they treated as not just subjects or people to be talked about, but agents of evangelization? And that's challenging, to lift up young people into not just leadership roles, to have like a spot on parish council, that's good, but to real decision-making roles, we're the people carrying forth the church in these next 20 and 30 years, which doesn't in any way say we should abandon those elders in our church now, but does say, let's walk this together.
And the elders are challenged to be accompaniers and to be, even particularly there was a time where he talks about the elderly and the connection with young people and the elderly, but just in general, the spiritual accompaniment and mentorship seems to be a particular theme. But that's what you made your intervention about.
That's right.
At the Synod itself.
Yeah, again, so everyone in the Synod Hall gets 4 minutes to talk about something, which is very moving how people spend those 4 minutes. So I chose to talk about just that theme of spiritual mentorship or spiritual accompaniment, which was, I would say, one of the key themes throughout the whole Synod. Recognizing that we just don't have a lot of adults in our church who accompany or walk with young people. And it's not something that you have to have a degree in. It's ordinary. It starts, of course, with our parents, people in our families accompany us. But the question I asked to the Pope and the bishops is, how many young people do you know by name? Again, just getting back to my own experience of faith, as I look back on my life, I had a lot of people who knew me by name, who mentored me, my parents, my siblings, the small church I grew up in, a youth minister, a chaplain in a high school, college chaplains and friends. And I realized, as talking to other people, not everyone is so lucky to have people who knew them by name. And, I pointed out that people leave the church for different reasons. For some, it's the abuse crisis, the distrust. Well, if we have mentors or close by friends to walk with young people, that's going to heal that trust. Some people leave because they disagree with what the church teaches. If you have people close by, mentors, to explain and break open the faith in a dialogue. And some people leave the church because they just feel anonymous. No one knows them. They move to a new city after graduating college, and they just feel alone. Well, again, that person's looking for someone close by, a friend, a spiritual mentor, to walk with them. So I think that really is the future of ministry with young people, at least in this country.
So what does implementation look like? We have implementation at the local level.
Right.
That's something that's really an expectation of this synod and the process with it, which there are a number of initiatives that are going on here in the United States and in dioceses related to this. The National Dialogue being one of them, which you're involved in. There's various meetings and summits and a lot of conversation in the field of pastoral ministry related to this topic prior to and during and now after. So what does that's one of the areas, right? Local level. What about the programmatic? We tend to hit the program button with youth and young adult ministry.
Yeah.
And where's the stance kind of on that related to that?
Yeah, on the first theme of local implementation, Pope Francis actually changed the rules or altered the guidelines for how synods work right before this synod to kind of fit it in. And what he did was emphasize two things. One, the importance of that pre-synod listening, which we talked about. But the second is he kind of lifted up the importance of the post-synod implementation. And at the very last talk at the synod, there was this expectation that the synod is not a document. It's to be lived, it's to be implemented, and that the implementation phase is an expectation. In fact, I think this summer they're having another gathering with young people in the Vatican to continue this spirit. I know that they've made some practical recommendations of the Vatican having offices or making more resources available to do just this implementation. But I think it starts with doing something. My biggest fear and concern is that we've spent a year listening to young people And if those young people are paying attention, they're going to say, now what are you going to do about it?
Yes, they're going to have an International Youth Forum. In fact, one of our colleagues, Brian Root, is going to be one of the 2 delegates that the USCCB is sending to that gathering, which will have Episcopal conferences, representatives from various nations, as well as then movements and associations to really look at this. All right, now here's all of these fruits of the synod. How do we implement this? What do we do with this? To have an international conversation about that. But each nation then, and each diocese, and each parish really needs to look at that. So in terms of the walking together, that's another aspect that comes up. And listening first. We tend to more toward the answers first, and the listening sometimes goes to the side. But it's not ultimately a meandering around this accompaniment. But it has to be a very profound listening.
Yeah, there's certainly a direction that we're walking, and I think you were so right that the implementation looks different, and that was raised by bishops in the synod that when you're talking about the experience of folks in Indonesia or Pakistan, it's different than the United States in terms of how we implement that. But I think at the end of the day, it can't be a programmatic response. I think we too quickly look to a plug-and-play resource, to a video series, even to this webinar, to be the fix, right? The idea is that we're entering into what the Synod talked about, which is what? Discernment. How do we discern as a local community? And that starts with living out the same pedagogy, right? To listen first, to look at the face of Christ, and then to respond. So at a personal level, I hope that, especially elders in our church, who I think make up most of the church leadership and key decision-making roles in our parishes and schools, I hope they get to know a young person by name. I've been surprised when I've talked with parish teams and I ask that question, the most people can come up with is 5 or 10 names. We're about a quarter of the population, young people. And so I think the first thing is get to know someone personally by name. The second, I think, I've been reflecting more like what made the synod work? Because there was really the spirit of joy. I talked to a number of bishops after, like, what did you like about it? And the first thing they said wasn't a theory or an idea, but it was the personal friendships. And so what sort of struck me was the synod is actually a really replicable kind of gathering, right? What if a local school or a local parish said, we're going to do a half day of reflection with our church, with 4 parish council members, kind of elders in the church, and 4 young people. And we're going to ask each of them to give a short couple-minute talk about their experience of the church and how it can grow and relate to young people, and then have them break off into coffee groups and have some conversations and put together maybe a brief action plan with prayer and adoration throughout the day. I think that would be remarkable type of gathering, right? If for no other reason than just that those 8 people got to know each other really well, and we're seeing each other as sort of walking together in this life of faith, yet alone for how that experience of that culture of encounter Francis talks about might make that parish council person pause when they look at the budget for the next year and say, you know what, we really need to think more about how we can prioritize young people.
And there's real opportunities there that people will sometimes say, oh, there aren't that many young people in my parish and so forth. Well, if you look at the demographics maybe at your parish, which a lot of dioceses can provide to their parishes, what's the demographic situation there? It may not be the current community that you have, and are people really looking at that? So when you talk about the leadership opportunities, what are some of the ways in which people can implement that? What does that look like in terms of leadership?
Yeah, I think it looks like every nook and cranny of the parish. And so certainly those key decision-making and consultative areas of parish life, but I would encourage parishes and leaders just to sort of take a look at who are the stakeholders in our community. And if we're missing folks from any key demographic that represents the parish boundary that we're called to be missional to, invite those people in. And if there's no one currently in that role, let someone be the point person to go engage those people. But I think we can always, create spaces within our parish to pass on leadership roles to other people. So for me, as I see in many parts of the country, the church is aging, not everywhere. It's an opportunity to enter into real mentorship. And so, if the head of ministry is in their 50s or 60s or 70s, maybe mentoring someone is mentoring a married guy or woman in their 40s, right? It doesn't have to be a teenager. And in fact, as we should have said earlier, the document really is talking about young adults. that's the primary audience. I mean, I think it would include, those teenage years as well when people begin to disaffiliate, but they're talking about people like us who are discerning a vocation, getting married or entering seminary, and then discerning really in the midst of those experiences of a vocation, right? So many couples like, me, we need more discussion on marriage, not for 6 months before we're married, but the 6 years after we're married, right? And young people look like that.
And we're developing co-responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think that's the primary piece of it. Before we go to questions, we want to talk about a little bit about the understanding of vocation, because vocation was widened in the conversation in the Synod. We have a video, an interview that our colleague Brian Rood did with Bishop Cajano, and him talking about that piece about vocation as really focusing in on the call, that we're all called to holiness, we're called to life, we're called, because we tend to kind of truncate the vocation, and ultimately the baptismal vocation, and then out of that, the other vocations coming. So there's some really beautiful language related to vocations. We do have a question, and so the question that we have has to do with, why Christ is alive. What's the reason for that title that we have for this particular document, do you think?
I think Pope Francis wants to just take us back to basics. I think he's done that a lot in his pontificate, to shine the light. We're talking about young people, that all of us are in need of healing and hope and renewal in our faith, especially in this season of church life. And the only way to find that healing, hope, and renewal is to recommit ourselves to a relationship with Jesus Christ and to live that through the sacramental life of the church. And that relationship asks and requires us to respond in some way. And we can respond by walking away, but we have to respond because Jesus is alive.
And here's another. What are some ways to promote a vocation being more than just the priesthood or religious life?
I like that you touched on that theme of expanding the sense of vocation. I think being in my 20s, I spent a lot of my time thinking about my vocation. Like, what was I supposed to be married? Was I supposed to be a priest? What am I going to do with my life? It's typical first world problems but serious spiritual problems as well, right? And so I think, my advice to my younger self or to teenagers and young adults now is the best way to discern your vocation is to live deeply the vocation you're in. And that's the vocation to holiness. And so I think it all starts there, that we often spend a little too much time stressing out about a future sacramental vocation that we haven't arrived at yet, and missing tons of opportunities to impact the lives of others by living a life of radical holiness today. And in fact, I sort of see this exhortation, Christ is alive, connected to the exhortation on holiness, just within the same 12-month window. Pope Francis has that beautiful exhortation, Gaudete ex exsultate, that I think is worth revisiting as well.
Yes, and especially the discernment pieces of that.
Yeah.
Both of the final chapter of this exhortation is about discernment, and the section on discernment in Gaudete et exsultate, and also on vocation and the call to holiness.
Yeah.
When those pieces are coupled together, it's extremely beautiful, and gives a way in which we can go about discerning our particular, how we go about living our vocation. And that part, I think, is sometimes, when we talk about discernment of vocation, it's usually the default is priesthood and religious life, or marriage. But what about that larger piece? How am I living? And that's something that we focus a great deal on as Catholic Apostolate Center. How am I living as a missionary disciple, as an apostle, as somebody who's sent by Christ out into the world to witness him, to witness that Christ is alive, and let other people know that. So I think that's an important thing. Here's another question from John from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. What are some key takeaways for young adult leaders from the exhortation?
I think the first key takeaway is you matter, and that what you're doing is so important and so needed.
The fact that it's written to young people,
precisely. I mean,
and then the people of God.
Exactly.
But that it's very clearly, and that's the first time.
Yeah.
That type of document, certainly of this level, is written in that way.
Absolutely. So I think the first ought to be really affirming and confirming of that apostolic call to ministry with young adults, and also to say that the church is on your side, right? It's not just some random idea that someone had. No, this is the expectation from an exhortation of Pope Francis that we minister to young people. Not that we're going to take the exhortation and beat someone over the head with it, but to say, let's break this open in this parish, not because I had some nice idea, but because this is essential to what it means to be the people of God.
Great. We have another question from Gabriella in Houston, Texas. After sitting in the Synod Hall, what did you see missing in the Apostolic Exhortation? Something that perhaps the Synodal Fathers spent time with, but it didn't make it into Christus Vivit.
Well, that's a great question, Gabrielle. A lot of things mentioned in the Synod Hall didn't make it in Pope Francis' document. Not everything could even make it in the final Synod document, both of which were pretty long texts. One of the key themes, when we talk about accompanying those who accompany, that phrase came up, that struck out to me was two things I'll share. One is this theme of integral formation. That when we talk about accompaniers, youth ministers, young adult leaders, like John asked, it's important that those people receive formation in spiritually, intellectually, pastorally, and theologically. And I think sometimes we could do a bit of a better job providing resources for formation of adults. Sometimes youth ministers or young adult ministers get thrown into the job because they're young. Young priests get thrown into the job because they're young. And there's a lot of great resources out there, that the Apostolate Center offers, like you mentioned, and others, to really see that as a more serious work. The second is integral human development. And so what was really striking were auditors like my friend Safa from Iraq talking about Christian persecution. We just saw the most violent example in months in Sri Lanka about that, the bombings of Catholic churches. He was talking about his friends getting murdered in church bombings in Iraq. Other people in India were talking about access to education for women. We live a very first world experience, sometimes cut off, though happily social media connects us to other people. And so I think we have a responsibility, as one bishop said, to help make good humans and always be attentive to meeting people's basic human needs as the gospel calls us.
Great. We have, what are some ideas for a parish to become more aware of Christus Vivit? How can the youth and young adult leaders, as well as parish leadership, better understand and implement all of this?
The first thing I would say is to read the document. I probably should have said that 20 times. Read the document, read the document. Don't read articles about the document. Don't just watch this webinar, but thanks for watching. Read the document, because it really will speak something to your heart, because Pope Francis, I think, wrote it with the Holy Spirit's inspiration. And I would say to consider sort of a mini synod. I think that's maybe the best idea I can recommend. Sitting down with elders in the church to learn from their experience. They, as Pope Francis said, they were young once too, and had that experience of taking over leadership in new ways and being open to new ideas. But I think it's really going to come through an encounter between elders and young people in discernment together over how we grow as a church that's going to make an impact.
Great. How can parishioners begin to know people by name, especially in areas with young people that move a lot?
Yeah, I could share 100 ideas on this, but I think it starts just at the end of Mass. We default to things being Father's job, but Father is greeting people, leaving Mass rapidly. He's the worst person able to have a conversation with people because people are always following to talk and to say hello, right? So it takes other committed adults to commit themselves. If you're a parish council member or in a position of leadership, commit yourself during the season of Easter. Every Sunday this Easter, introduce yourself to one young person and listen to their story. Like Jesus, ask more questions than answers you give. Every young person loves a good home-cooked meal. Take them out for a cup of coffee or have a home-cooked meal. One of our pastors here in D.C., when people register, started asking if they'd like to meet up for a cup of coffee to learn more about the church. And almost every young adult has said, yes, I'd love to learn more. And so it just takes a personal touch to invest in people and in the time to not just talk to the people but just have a conversation.
Great. Well, thanks for being with us, Jonathan. We really appreciate it. Join us for our next webinar series with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, NFCYM, National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministry, and the Southeast Pastoral Institute, and we're co-sponsoring a set of 8 different webinars, 4 in English, 4 in Spanish, on topics related to the Synod and Christus Vivit. Thank you for joining us, and may the charity of Christ urge us on.